This public domain reading is Austin Bidwell's Travels, From Wall Street to London Prison, 15 Years in Solitude. Chapter 8. The Merry Summer over ANDNO Harvest Stored. From Cologne to Frankfort is about 140 miles, and swiftly our train sped along up the Rhine, the lovely stream about which poets have raved for 20 generations. What classic ground! What scenes have its waters reflected, its mountains looked upon! In the old days its rolling floods made a deep impression on the stout Roman heart. More than one army, carrying with it the hearts of the Roman world, had crossed that river and plunged into the unknown forests beyond, only to go down in the shock of conflict with the brave but barbarian foe, leaving not one solitary survivor to carry back tidings to Rome of the fate of her army. And down through all the linked centuries the history of the Rhine has been the history of giant armies marching against each other, and of brothers slaughtering brothers. Today the plains of Germany and France bear 1 million of armed men, ranged face to face with only the Rhine between, eagerly awaiting the signal to pour a deadly rain on each other. And for what? The last face that I saw at the Cologne station was that of Amstel, lit up with smiles as he waved his hand in adieu. Sitting cosily in the corner of the carriage, eager to see all that was to be seen, I found, as all tourists do, much to charm and delight. But my thoughts were on the bonds I had to sell, and I was glad enough when at 5 o'clock our train drew into the depot at Frankfort. Alighting, I took a cab and drove to the Hotel Landsberg, and, although tired, the scenes and surroundings were too novel for me to think of sleep. So I dined and went out to view the city, but as I will have occasion to refer to the place again, I will leave any description of it until another chapter. In London there was an American banking house that has since failed, but which at this time was doing a large business in the way of issuing letters of credit. The firm was patronized chiefly by Americans. It issued credits or letters of credit without inquiry to anyone applying for them. While in London I called at their office, 449 Strand, and paying £750 was given a credit for L150, which I took under an assumed name. I wanted this letter to serve as an introduction to some of the bankers at Frankfort and to open the way for the negotiation of the bonds. The Frankfort correspondents of the London firm were Kraut, Lautner and Co. on the Gallows-Gasse. The next morning I repaired to the office of this firm, and producing my letter was very cordially received and invited to make my headquarters in their office during my stay at Frankfort, which for the next day or two I did. However, I called on several other bankers, also feeling the way, and finally selected the firm of Merpago and Weisweller, bankers widely known and of enormous wealth. I had several talks with Merpago, and told him I was arranging to purchase a number of copper mines in Austria, and if the deal was closed, I should sell a large block of American bonds and use the cash I realized to pay for the purchase of the mines. I suppose he thought to make a good thing out of it, and was eager to purchase. My reader will recall that payment upon all United States bonds payable to bearer, as mine were, could not be stopped, and so far as the innocent holder was concerned, he was perfectly secure. But the custom among bankers was, whenever any bonds were lost by theft or fraud, to send out circulars containing the numbers, asking that the parties offering them might be questioned and held. But as American bonds were sold in millions all over the continent, and were passing freely from hand to hand, as a matter of fact, little or no attention was paid to such circulars, but of course had strangers of disreputable appearance offered bonds in large sums. The lists might have been scrutinized and awkward questions asked. Therefore, I felt a trifle nervous, and determined to run no chance of losing my bonds, at least not all of them. So I resolved to go to Wiesbaden, some 15 miles away, stop at some hotel under a different name, leave the bonds there, and take the morning train for Frankfort, conduct my negotiations, and return to Wiesbaden every evening. It was at this time easy to lose one's identity in Wiesbaden, for the town then was, along with Baden-Baden, the Monte Carlo of the continent, and adventurers, men and women, from all over Europe flocked there in thousands to chance their fortune in the gambling halls. Although a little in advance of this portion of my history, I will here relate an adventure of mine there, some years after the period of which I am speaking. I will, however, preface my narrative with a brief account of the history of the place. The city of Wiesbaden, previous to the Franco-German War of 1870, was the chief town of one of those petty principalities which were plentifully sprinkled over the face of Europe. Since the old Roman days, the town had been famous for its hot springs, and consequently for its hot baths, and a good many people, during the winter particularly, resorted there to bathe and to drink the waters. As a matter of course, the townspeople, as the custom of such places is, have recorded many a marvellous cure, ranging all the way from headache to hydrophobia. But still the town was of little importance save locally. The petty ruler, with a title longer than his income, lived in the pretentious castle, beguiling the time by smoking cheap cigars or ordering on banquets whose piece de resistance consisted of gebraten and gans and kartoffeln, the unlucky bird being tribute in kind from the farmyard of some peasant subject living in a miserable hut on black bread. But a change was impending. A mighty wizard had visited the place, with an eye quick to see the possibilities of the situation, with a brain to plan and a hand to execute. His name was Francois Blanc, the head of the great gambling establishment at Homburg. Vast as were his ambition and achievements, he was a man of the simplest tastes. To see him, as I often have, in his seedy coat, his old-fashioned spectacles on the tip of his nose, one would have taken him for a country advocate whose wildest dreams were of a practice of 2,000 thalers a year, with an old gig and wheezy mare to haul him around the countryside from client to client. Before his Wiesbaden days, he had been the guiding spirit in the direction of the splendid gambling halls, the casino at Homburg. Blanc was impervious to flattery, a hard-headed, silent man, a man without enthusiasm and without weaknesses, who kept a lavish table and ate sparingly himself, who had a wine cellar rivaling that of the autocrat of all the Russias and yet contented himself with sipping a harmless mineral water, who kept and directed a huge gambling machine, a mighty conglomeration of gorgeously decorated halls, wine parlours and music rooms, crammed day and night by giddy and excited throngs, but himself never indulging in anything more exciting than an after-dinner game of dominoes or a quiet drive with his wife through the country lanes. Thus this Francois Blanc, with perfect equanimity, watched the thousands of butterflies and moths of society scorch their wings in the terrific flame that glowed in his casino, while he looked on, a cynical observer, despising the fools enraptured with roulette and fascinated with rouge et noir. But one thing he was not afraid of, and that was spending money. To compass his business ends he laid it out lavishly, and in the end he drew all Europe to Wiesbaden. Still broader and still deeper, he laid the foundations of the fortune that ultimately grew to colossal proportions. But he did not make Wiesbaden famous without keen opposition. He made the fortune of the beggarly Prince Karl and the whole hungry crowd of royal highnesses in spite of themselves. At every fresh opposition he simply opened his purse and a golden shower fell on them. It required a hard head to withstand the attacks made on him when it became known that he had bought up both prince and municipality and proposed to make Wiesbaden par excellence the gambling city of the continent. But despite of all, he pushed on his plans to wonderful success. A great park was laid out, and stately buildings arose, all dedicated to the goddess of chance. Slim was the chance the votaries of the game had in his gorgeous halls. He threw out his money in millions, but he knew the weak, foolish heart of man, the egotism of each and every one of us, that leads us to ignore for ourselves the immutable law of numbers. So he counted upon his returns, and never counted in vain. As I say, he had a hard head to withstand the attacks made upon him. Every day the post brought hundreds of letters containing propositions of threats from people who had lost their money and demanded its return with fierce threats, pitiful supplications and warnings of intended suicide, place, date, and hour carefully specified, so there could be no mistake, and more than one attempt was made upon his life. But the equanimity of Francois Blanc was equal to all adventures. Threats, prayers, temptations left him untouched. This man of ice, self-possessed, cold, indifferent to the ruin of the thousands of victims of his will, had a fad or fancy. It was for raising red and white roses, and while the mad throngs were fluttering in frenzy around the tables in his halls at Homburg, Wiesbaden and Monte Carlo, he, hoe or trowel in hand, would be training and transplanting his roses, solicitous over an opening bud or deploring the ravages of an insect, or again, refusing all invitations, would sit down with his wife to a dinner of boiled turnips and bacon, washed down with a glass of Vichy water and milk. This was the town, and these the scenes constantly occurring there. Now for my adventure. In 1870, just before the war cloud burst, covering all that part of the world, I was stopping for some weeks at the Hotel Nassau. It stands in the main street, opposite the park gate leading to the casino. All the world went to Wiesbaden to be amused. However fashionable frivolity and vice may be elsewhere, Here it was strictly de rigueur, and to pretend to decency and sobriety would be to stamp oneself a heathen and barbarian, all unversed in the glorious flower-wreathed primrose way of our orb. The daily routine for the throng began with coffee in bed at 8 a.m., then dressing gowns were donned, and the bath in underground floors of the hotel was sought and a bath had in the hot mineral waters, which were conducted to all the hotels direct from the hot springs of the town. Half an hour in the bath, then a light breakfast, preparatory to sallying out for an hour on the spaziergang around the Quellen to drink the water, listen to the band, see and be seen, but above all, to gossip and tell lies. At 11 a.m., the gambling began in the casino, and with a rush the seats around the tables would be filled. Then speedily there would be rows behind rows of eager players or spectators, and what a sight it all was to the cool-headed observer. With what keen interest all watched the result of the first turn of the card at the card tables and the colour of the first hit at roulette. For all gamblers are superstitious and are devout believers in omens. Those whose luck or pocketbooks held out gambled steadily on, or, if luck turned against them, would leave the table, go to do some fantastic thing to change their luck, and then return. At 2 p.m, the band, a very fine one, played in the music sale, and most of the idlers and morning players gathered there to listen to the music and to drink and dine. Here in this hall, the intrigues begun on the promenade, or in the gambling rooms, were helped along by the ample opportunities of meeting, with the passion stimulated by the music and the wine. At 4 o'clock, many took an afternoon nap. Then came the chief event of the day, the ponderous table d'hôte. At 9 p.m. everyone flocked to the casino, and the game went merrily on until midnight. Then to bed, each and all with more or less Rudesheimer or Hochheimer stowed away. At the time of which I speak many were my idle days, in which I was free to seek pleasure. I used to find much enjoyment in frequenting the casino to watch the people, and to play the role of looker-on in Vienna, which, by the way, is a star role, and therefore rather agreeable. One evening, while watching the Rouge et Noir, I noticed a lady just in front of me, magnificently dressed in all, save that there was an entire absence of jewellery. She was literally dressed to kill, and, although near 50, yet to the casual observer she seemed no more than 40, or even less. She was a well-preserved woman of the world, and was known as the Countess de Windsorrel. This was the adventuress who had married Van Tromp some 2 years before. What a career had been that of this woman! She had been mistress from first to last of a dozen men, noblemen, diplomats, soldiers, but being an inveterate gambler, one after another saw, with dismay, the cash, estates, diamonds, carriages, costly furs and laces he showered upon her all go whirling into the ever-open maw of the casino, or in the drawing-room games of the Bon Ton in Paris or Petersburg. And one brave youth, an officer in the Prussian Guards, had, in his infatuation for the Countess, and impregnable, as he thought, against bankruptcy by reason of his great fortune, tried to satisfy her cravings for splendour of entourage and her infatuation for gambling. The result was that one day the crack of a pistol shot was heard in the Countess' chamber, and the servants rushing in found the young bankrupt dead, lying across the bed with a bullet through the heart. The next day a horde of clamorous creditors besieged the house, where the Countess calmly told them she had sent for her bankers, and on the morrow they would be paid. That night his comrades buried their dead friend with military honours. At midnight the cortege passed the hotel, and all eyes watched the lovely Countess robed in white as she appeared, her bosom heaving with emotion, while she waved a farewell to her dead lover. 10 minutes later she fled through the back door and over the garden wall, falling into the arms of another lover waiting there. He himself did not go the way of the last, but half of his fortune did. So one morning, leaving a polite note of farewell, he, taking for companion the dressing-maid of his mistress, embarked for America. At the time I met her, the Countess's reputation was too well known, and her beauty too much fallen off for her to make any more grand catches. A local banker at Wiesbaden became very friendly. However, the friendship lost all its warmth when the banker's stout wife one day caught them together, and having already provided herself with a whip in anticipation, visited them both with a jealous woman's rage and a sound thrashing. Now, the Countess spent her time around the tables, following the winners and getting douses from them. These were by no means small, most of them being gifts pure and simple, given from mere goodness of heart or sheer prodigality, for there were too many gay and beautiful women flocking around, ready to smile on winners in the game for the Countess now, to make even a temporary conquest. However, At this period she lived well, even extravagantly, but of course saved nothing. As related, I first met the Countess here at the table where the game was going on. She had just staked and lost her last gulden. She was betting on the black, and 4 times in succession the red had won. She turned, and looking in my face, implored me to bet a double Frederick on the red. I instantly placed the money on the red and won. She begged me to transfer the stake to the black. I did so, and black won. Placing her hand on the stake, she said, "Sir, leave it, black will win again." Sure enough, it did. She seized the cash, $80, and handing me a double Frederick, said in her most bewitching manner, "Oh, sir, be generous and let me keep this." I said, "Certainly, madame." She promptly staked it, and in 2 turns of the cards it was gone. We met several times the next few days, but merely bowed without speaking. One afternoon, entering the music sale, I took a small table and, ordering a bottle of wine, sat down to listen to the music and watch the throng. The Countess came in, and seeing me alone, came straight to me, shook hands warmly, and sat down. I, of course, invited her to have a glass of wine. We soon finished that bottle and ordered another. We had what was to me a most amusing talk. She was a character, had been everywhere, and spoke all the modern languages. She assured me that I was a very charming gentleman. In paying my bill, I incautiously displayed a gold piece or 2, and seeing she was going to ask me to give her one, I saved her the trouble by placing one in her hand. In time we became quite good friends. Twice I paid her board bill in order to rescue her wardrobe from the clutches of her landlord, and once I saved her from the hands of an irate washerwoman. When, after a time, I left Wiesbaden, I left her as gay, as prosperous, and as extravagant as ever. I did not see Wiesbaden again for over 2 years, but the 2nd week of January, 1873, found me there. The Prussian government now ruled in the town and refused to renew the license of Memmi Blanc. It had expired 14 days before my arrival. What a change had fallen on the town! The casino was gloomy and cold, the gay crowds had fled. All the life and movement of the street and promenade was forever a thing of the past. I had located there simply as a precaution, disposing of large amounts of bonds in Frankfort, 15 miles away, and returning to Wiesbaden each night. At this time I put up at the Hotel Victoria, near the railroad station. One Saturday, going up to Frankfort rather late, my business detained me until after dark. On reaching the station I happened to look into the 3rd-class waiting room, and there I spied a figure alone that looked familiar. I soon recognized the Countess. From her appearance and surroundings, it was plain that there was now no wealthy lover at her beck and call. Because she looked so unhappy, I gave her a cordial greeting, which she returned rather wearily. It was very cold, and I was clad in furs from head to foot. Besides, I was apparently on the full flood tide of fortune, having with me then a very large sum of money, some of which she could have had for the asking. I said, "Come, Countess, let us go together 1st class to Wiesbaden." She replied that she lived at Biebrich, a small town on the Rhine, 4 miles below Mayence and 4 miles from Wiesbaden. As the train was starting, I bade her goodbye, but asked permission to call on her the next day. She consented, giving her address as Hotel Bellevue. The next morning was very cold, but I enjoyed that, so, after a light breakfast, I started over the hills for a walk to the town, arriving there soon after noon. I found the hotel, a 5th-rate one, and entering, was shown to the room of the Countess. What a change for her from the past! Her room was a small one, plastered, but unpapered, and with a few articles of furniture of the cheapest. The poor woman was too evidently in a state of frightful depression, and well she might be. Hers had been a butterfly existence, life all one summer holiday, no hostages given to fortune, no bond taken against future wreck or change. Like the butterfly, she had roamed from flower to flower, sipping the sweet only, or, like the cricket, had merrily piped all the summer through, thinking sunshine and bloom eternal. Even when youth and beauty had fled, and lovers no longer stood ready to attend and serve, she still found a good aftermath in her happy harvest field on the floors of the casino. But when the casino lights at Wiesbaden went out, then, for the Countess, had the winter indeed come. My walk had given me something of an appetite, and it now being 2 o'clock, I at once proposed to have dinner. To my surprise, she said she had already dined, and upon my remarking that it was early for dinner, she replied that it was. But as she was owing quite a hotel bill, she feared to give any trouble lest the landlord might present his bill, and in default of payment she was liable to arrest and a very considerable imprisonment. I need hardly tell my readers that they do these things differently in Germany than with us. I could easily afford to be generous with other people's money and did not mean to see the Countess suffer for a hotel bill. Ringing the bell, I told the waiter to bring me some dinner and a bottle of wine. The Countess looked very uneasy over my order. Of late years she had seen life from the seamy side and had observed so much of the falseness and cruelty of men that she had apparently lost all faith in them, and no doubt thought me an adventurer, one who might possibly dine and order expensive wines, leaving her to face an angry landlord. While dinner was being prepared, she told me she was in the greatest distress, had not even a single kreutzer to pay postage, and, worst of all, was owing for 2 weeks' board. She had no means to fly, no place to fly to, and if she remained incarceration awaited her. She had for weeks been writing everywhere to everyone she had known, former lovers, distant but long neglected relatives. The result, dead silence, no response from anywhere. She at last was alone, caught in the world's great snare, with no friendly hand to shelter or save. It was a sight to read this woman's face. There swept over it all the conflicting waves of regrets over might, have-beens, and the gloomy shades of despair. Both proprietor and waiter appeared to set the table. It was for one, but wine-glasses for two were brought unsolicited. They were officiously anxious to please Your Highness, as they christened me. The Countess sat looking gloomily out of the window across the Rhine, while I watched her face until an infinite pity for the shipwrecked soul filled my mind. Dismissing the waiter, I went to the window, and standing by her chair I said, "Don't worry any more, Countess, I will pay your bill." At the same time, drawing from an inner pocket a book crammed with notes, I placed 7 100-thaler notes in her lap, saying, "This one is for your board bill, and the other 6 are for your pocket money." I need not attempt to picture her amazement and delight. Certainly she appeared very grateful. We had a long conversation, and I was talking to her like a brother. Perhaps had she still been beautiful and young, my manner and language might have been less brotherly. I told her she had danced and sung, but at last the time had come for toil, and suggested she should go to Brussels, which is ever thronged with tourists, where her knowledge of languages and her savoir-faire could be made available in one of the many shops where gimcracks are sold to travellers. I advised her to offer a small premium for a position. This she said she would do. In saying goodbye, I promised to see her again the next night. But I found a telegram awaiting me on my arrival at my hotel, which called me to meet 2 of my companions at Calais, and I was forced to leave by an early train. The next time I saw the Countess was at Newgate. She visited me there, and was in perfect despair over my position and her inability to serve me. For those who may care to know more of her, I will say that, following my advice, she went to Brussels and obtained a position in a tourist exchange, and within a year married the proprietor, who was a councilman and a man of considerable local importance. She made him a good wife, and became a true mother to his 5 daughters. When he died, he made her guardian to both of them and his wealth. She became very religious, and to the last was a devout member of the Roman Church. She died in 1886, 13 years after the episode at Rieberich. Her ashes rest in the little graveyard of the Convent des Sœurs de Stay. Agnes on the Charleroi Road, 2 miles from the city, and on her monument is engraved, T.O. Elizabeth, the beloved wife, pious and true. She served God and has gone to live with the angels. Chapter 9. W.E. have another JOBFORYOU. About every second day I called on Merpago and Weisweller in Frankfort and talked over matters, and easily saw that everything would go right. All that was necessary was to produce the bonds, and they would hand over the cash. Here in America, though we scrutinized a man's garments, the quality and fit of the same having a certain value, we never take much stock in a stranger, because an artist tailor has decorated him, or because he has plenty of money. But in the 70s, all over Europe, from the mere fact that a man was an American and had the appearance, dress and manner of a gentleman, they always took it for granted that he must be a gentleman. Therefore, seeing that I was taken for a capitalist and that no question would be asked, I told the firm my deal in Austrian copper mines appeared so certain to be completed that I had ordered the securities I intended to dispose of to be forwarded from London. Giving them a list, they gave me a memorandum offer for the lot. I accepted their offer. The next hour was a very bad 60 minutes for me. There was considerable delay, and my suspicions were fully aroused, and at one time I thought they had made some discovery, but, as a fact, my suspicions were wholly unfounded. The banker and clerks were simply hurrying around, anxious to oblige me and have the money out of the bank before it closed. At last the amounts were figured up and verified by myself. One of the partners hastened off to the bank and in 5 minutes returned with a very pretty parcel of 200,000 gulden. But, in spite of the evident safety of the business, I was nervous and resolved to put a good distance between me and the town as speedily as possible. Before 5 o'clock, I was in Wiesbaden, and, going directly to the casino, where they kept at all times 1,000,000 francs, in addition to German money, and where the possession of large sums attract no attention, I readily exchanged my money for 351,000 franc notes. Going to Rothschild's, I bought exchange on New York for 80,000, and left the same night for London. Very many times I journeyed over that route in after years, but never with so light a heart. I was young and enthusiastic, all the glamour and poetry of life hung around me, while I was too inexperienced to notice whither I was drifting, or to understand the powerful current upon which I had embarked. In fact, I had sold myself to do the devil's work, and day by day the chain would tighten, while all the time I thought I could, when I pleased, stop short on the downward grade and take the back track. More experience would have taught me that everyone who forsook the path of honour not only thought the same, but had a purpose to even everything up some day and make restitution. And today, there is not a criminal but who, at the start, looks forward to the time when he will no longer war against society, but will go out and come in at peace with all men. But when one comes to think of it, what a fool's game is that of a man who fights against society. The criminal has but 2 arms, very short and weak they are, and of flesh too. He has but 2 eyes that cannot possibly see around the nearest corner, while society has 1,000,000 arms of steel that can reach around the world, and 1,000,000 eyes which are never closed, that can pierce the thickest gloom with sleepless vigilance. And the poor, unhappy criminal, by fortunate dexterity, may escape for a little, but at last society lays her iron grasp on him, and with giant force hurls him into a dungeon. As for the short-lived, tempestuous success that some few criminals have, is there any sweetness in it? I say no, success won in honest fight is sweet, but I know from my own experience that the success of crime brings no sweetness, no blessing with it, but leaves the mind a prey to 1,000 haunting fears that make shipwreck of peace. There were no sleeping cars in all Europe then, so I sat up in a compartment and really enjoyed the ride, viewing the country by moonlight. At midnight we arrived at Calais and took the boat for Dover, then the express for London. Arriving at Victoria Station, I took a cab to Mrs. Green's, where I had breakfast à l'anglaise. I had a little adventure that night going down the Strand. At Bow Street, on the corner, is the Gaiety, a famous drinking saloon, flooded with light inside and out, with more than 6 handsome barmaids. Barmaids are a great institution in England. That is, they have never more than 1 man behind a bar, none at all in the railway bars. And a fearful source of ruin to the girls, as they are to thousands of young men, I might say tens of thousands every year. These girls are chosen for their beauty and attractiveness. Yearly, in London and in other large cities of England, a beautiful barmaid show is one of the stated features, and is held in some public garden or monster hall. These exhibitions are wonderfully popular, and thousands flock to them. Various beauty contests are got up, and all the popular features of voting and so on are in vogue. Those of the young women who win the prizes make their fortunes, for they are at once engaged at high salaries for the more aristocratic barrooms. Fancy what an attraction, and even fascination, the gin palace with lovely girls behind the bar must have to the youth of a great city. Many of them strangers, busy during the day, but with nothing to do at night, with the choice of the street or a sombre room, but sure of a sweet smile of welcome from a fascinating woman in the barrooms. How easily, and how naturally, too, does a young man become ensnared. But how if he has no money, no smiles and no welcome for him? And then, what a temptation to help himself to his master's cash. Happy for our country that our laws forbid women entering that occupation. While standing in the brilliant light of the Gaiety, watching the thronging crowd of passers-by, with its sprinkling of unfortunates, I saw one poor bedraggled creature, wan-faced and hollow-eyed, with hunger and despair imprinted on every feature. Looking sharply at her, she caught my eye, and, crossing the street, she spoke to me. The poor thing looked as if she had been dragged through all the gutters of London. She said that herself and her baby were actually starving. that her husband had been out of work 13 weeks and had then deserted her, owing 12 weeks' rent, and the landlady had just told her that unless she paid her some rent before 9 o'clock that night, she would be turned out with her baby into the streets. Those of my readers who have been in London know something of what it would mean for this woman to be turned out into the streets of that fearful Babylon. No wonder, then, the poor soul was frantic with despair. In her poverty, a shilling looked as big as a cartwheel, and when I said to her, "Will you promise to go direct home if I give you a sovereign?" she cried out, "Oh, sir, God forever bless you if you will." I gave her the 5, and as she started to run, I caught her by the sleeve and said, "I will go home with you to see if you have told me the truth." She lived close by, in one of those teeming courts that run off from the Strand. We found her baby naked on a heap of rags, in a small, dirty room containing 2 broken chairs for furniture. I felt that there were in the large city thousands of similar cases, but this one was brought home to me. I was young and impressionable. More than that, I had other people's money to be liberal with, so I called up the landlady, who, almost dumb with surprise, received the arrears of rent along with a month in advance. Eliza, for that was her name, told me she could get work if she had clean clothes for herself and baby, which she could buy for L2. I gave her 5, and giving her my address in New York, told her to find work and let me know how she got on. She did find work in an eel pie shop in Red Lion Square, High Holborn. I saw her 2 years later in London, and possibly may refer to her again in this story. I went down to Liverpool and embarked on the good ship Java. 10 days later, we sailed through the Narrows. During my last day in London, I went to Westminster Abbey and spent 3 hours in that Valhalla of the Anglo-Saxon race. It made a tremendous impression upon my mind. In no other work of human hands do the spirits of so many departed heroes linger. Certainly in no other does the dust of so many of the great dead rest. And as I read memorial upon memorial to departed greatness, I realized that the path of honor and of truth was the only one for men to tread. All through the voyage the influences of the Abbey were upon me. I felt I was treading on dangerous ground, and resolved I would have no more of it. Would I had then resolved, when I met Irving and Co., to throw all the plunder in their faces and say, "I'll have none of it, and here we part." I felt that I ought to do that, but weakly said, "I need the 10,000, and I'll give the rogues their share, and then see them no more." I had fully made up my mind to that, knowing Irving would be on the wharf, eager to meet me. In sailing through the Narrows and past Staten Island, I was making up my mind as to the little speech I would make. We rapidly neared the wharf in Jersey City, and I quickly recognized Irving standing on the edge of the closely packed crowd, watching the steamer with a nervous look on his face. A rogue suspects everyone, and although by this time he had become pretty well satisfied as to my good faith, no doubt he would be happier when he had his share of the plunder safe in his pocket. I was standing close to the rail between 2 ladies, and saw Irving before he saw me. Waving my handkerchief, his eye suddenly fell on me. With a smile, and pointing significantly to my pocket, I gave him a salute. An eager look came into his face, and waving his hand he cried out, "I am glad to see you." And no doubt he spoke the truth. When the gangplank was thrown ashore, and I saw him making his way toward it, evidently intending to board the steamer, I thought how surprised he would be when I told him I would have no more of his game. He sprang on board, rushed to me with a beaming face, grasped my hand, and putting the other on my shoulder, led me toward the gangway. He had not spoken yet, but as we were going down the gangplank he said, "My boy, you have done splendidly," and then, putting his mouth close to my ear, whispered, "We have got another job for you, and it's a beauty." I don't mean to pester my reader with a moral, or by too much moralizing, although I am tempted to do so. There is ample material for a course of sermons, in that we have another job for you coming to me just then. But, leaving my reader to draw his own moral, I must go on with my narrative. Rowing up the wharf with Irving, I was on the point of telling him I wanted no more jobs, but weakly put it off, and by so doing, of course, made it more difficult. He told me Stanley and White were waiting at Taylor's Hotel on Montgomery Street, a few doors up from the wharf. We soon were there, and they gave me a warm and even enthusiastic reception. Then I began to tell some of my adventures on the journey, to which they listened with unfeigned admiration, and, opening my bag, I produced the 16 bills of exchange for 5,000 each, informing them they should have their cash in 90 minutes. It was curious to see these men handle the bills of exchange, passing them from one to another, examining them with anxious care. But where were my good resolutions, and what had become of them? Why, they, under the effect of the wine and the magnetic influence of these 3 minds, had gone flying down the bay, and under a favourable gale were fast speeding seaward beyond the ken of mortal eye, not to be found by me again until years after, when, with the toils about me, I found myself in Newgate. Then the fugitives all came back, this time to stay. My 3 graces who adorned the police department of New York were full of matter of a new enterprise, which by my cooperation was to make the fortunes of us all. But they were too evidently anxious, too eagerly desirous to handle the greenbacks my bills of exchange represented, to fix their minds upon anything else. Stanley and White went away together, but first each once more told me privately that he depended upon me to put in his own hands his share, showing how these rogues suspected each other, and indeed were full of suspicions of every one and everything. Irving crossed the ferry with me, but on the New York side dropped behind, and, although I paid no more attention to him, no doubt he followed me. The excitement of success and of being at home again banished any possible regrets or fears over the course I had entered, and with a light heart and buoyant step, I quickly made my way to a friend of mine, a well-known broker in New Street, shook hands with him, and, telling him, very much to his surprise, that I had just returned from Europe, asked him to step around the corner to the office of the bankers and identify me. In a minute we were there. Endorsing the drafts, I told them to make it in 500s. They sent out to the bank for them, and I was speedily on my way to our rendezvous with 16500 greenbacks in a roll. And meeting the 3 at the wine room, I made their eyes grow big when I flashed the roll on their delighted orbs. The division was speedily made, I retaining 10,000 for my share, and each promptly threw out 1,000, and we shook hands all around and parted. Here were 4 conspirators of us, and it was comical to see how anxious we all were to get away so that each could stow his plunder in a safe place. For my part, one went home, but I shall say nothing of the meeting with the members of my family. I told them I had made a lot of money in a speculation, and not knowing the inside history, or suspecting anything, they rejoiced with me and were proud and happy for their boy. I spent about $1,000 making things comfortable for them, but to their grief, I told them that circumstances required me to take up my former quarters at the St. Nicholas. It would be interesting to tell of my reception among my acquaintances on Wall Street and other parts of the city. Rumour magnified my resources, and it was reported I had cleared $100,000 in some fortunate deal. It was strange to see the newfound deference all around, from my former employers down to my old waiter at downtown Delmonico's, where I dined, but I will pass over all these matters and proceed with my history of the Primrose Way. The next few days I went about engaged in the to me very agreeable task of paying all my debts. The largest debt I was owing was one of 1,300, partly borrowed money and partly a long-standing balance due on a speculation negotiated on my account, and which did not pan out but entailed a loss. Then I indulged pretty freely in many little extravagances in the way of tailor bills, and so on 2 friends struck me for a loan, and, strange to say, both remain unpaid to this hour, along with some 25 years' interest. So, within a fortnight of my landing, I found my 13,000 reduced quite 1/2, and as I was cherishing visions of unbounded wealth, I began to feel quite poor and anxious to see some outcome to this other job my friends said they had ready for me. It was at the very door. Chapter 10. A 19th-century prodigal. Let no man who may be tempted to commit a crime ever fancy that if he takes the first step downhill he will stop until he reaches the bottom. If one of my readers flatters himself he can go 1 step, with no more to follow, on the downward road, let such an one read this story to the end, and then forever abandon such an idea as a fancy born of inexperience. For this history is as a handwriting on the wall, full of warning to all and everyone who may be tempted to take 1 step in any other path than the path of honour. In 1865 there lived in London a famous Queen's Counsel, Edwin James. Fame and fortune were his. A born orator, a talented scholar, he rapidly pushed his way from the very bottom of the legal profession to all but its topmost height. At 40 he found himself facile princeps of the English bar, and public opinion, that potent factor in popular government, had already singled him out for the high position of Attorney General. That secured, only 1 step remained to place him in the seat of the Lord Chancellor. Truly, an imperial position, one that satisfied the proud ambition of a Wolsey and fitted the genius of a Thomas à Becket. It carries with it the position of keeper of the conscience of Her Majesty, giving the possessor precedence in all official functions over the English aristocracy, next to royalty itself. But about this time dark whispers began to fly about through the clubs of London. Soon it became known that Edwin James, the Lord Chancellor-to-be, was in the toils, and it shortly transpired that, in spite of the fact that his income from his profession was nearer 20 than £10,000 per annum, it had proved insufficient and he was heavily in debt, and worse. It would seem he was keeping up what in the polite language of society are known as dual houses. A woman of brilliant beauty presided over one, and the marvellous beauty of its mistress was only equalled by her extravagance. He also had a fondness for associating with younger men than himself, and had got into a particularly fast set of young lords and army men. At his club he had lost large sums at baccarat and loo, and, in an unhappy hour for himself and his, he stooped from his high position and, miserable to think of, committed a crime. This, in the expectation that he would relieve himself from some of the more crushing obligations he had heaped upon himself, either through the extravagant vagaries of his imperious mistress, or by his own rashness in trying his luck among a lot of titled sharpers. He had among his clients one fast, even madly extravagant youth, heir of an historic name and of a lordly estate. To supply his extravagance, my lord had applied to the money-lenders, those sharks that in London, as elsewhere, fatten on such game. These gentry were eager to lend the young blood money upon what are known in English law as post-obits, which loans in this particular case carried the trifling interest of about 100% per annum. James was cognizant of his friend's excursions among the moneylenders, and no doubt he thought the young spendthrift, when he came into his fortune, would never know within a good many thousands how much he had borrowed, nor even the number of post-obits he had given. I will just explain that a post-obit is a form of note or due bill given by the heir of an estate, usually of an entailed estate, which matures the moment the drawer of the document enters into that estate. That is to say, the tender-hearted son discounts his father's death to provide fuel to feed his flame. So Edwin James, driven to his own destruction, stooped from his imperial position into what one might call ankle depth of crime. How little he dreamed there was a beyond, a huge seething sea of crime, an ocean whose billows are of ink, and which would soon sweep him from his high place into the black waters, there to be buffeted until, honour and hope all gone, he would, throwing his hands to heaven with one despairing cry, sink into its inky depths, adding one more ruined life to the millions already engulfed. In that long, sad catalogue of the dead, there is probably not one who, when taking the first step into crime, ever thought a second would follow the first. But to come back to our gilded sir. He made out 2 post-obits for L5,000, wrote his client's name at the bottom of each, gave them to the moneylenders, who, never doubting that the prodigal son had signed and given them to his counsel, made no question, but gave James the money for them at once. But James had reckoned without his host, for this 19th century prodigal was made of keener metal than he of the first. Strange to say, and utterly unexpected as it was to all who knew him and had looked upon his riotous living, he kept his books straight and knew to a single guinea how much and to whom he was owing. His discovery of the forgery was accelerated by the sudden and most unexpected death of his father, his return home and stepping into his estate. The various post-obits were presented and placed before him. He instantly pronounced the 2 for £5,000 each to be forgeries, and the crime was easily laid at the door of the Queen's Council. The heir indignantly refused to condone the offence, and, revealing the fatal secret to a few, within a month it was known in every club-room in London. From there it got into the newspapers, and they, under a thinly disguised alias of a distinguished member of the bar, gave more or less accurate details of the damning truth. His former client eventually said he would not prosecute the forgery if the criminal left England. If not, he would immediately go before the grand jury, procure an indictment, and have this man, who had moved a prince among men, arraigned in the dock at the Old Bailey, there to plead and stand trial like any common criminal. And he fled. Of course, like all fugitives from justice throughout the old world, he looked to America for a city of refuge, and here he came. Not to keep my readers too long from the main narrative, it will suffice to say that soon after his arrival he applied for admission to the bar of New York, but first he won to his cause the high-souled Richard O'Gorman, then a leader of his profession. It was for Edwin James a lucky stroke, for at this time O'Gorman was in full possession of his magnificent powers. Few could resist his magic. His great heart was stirred, and he took up the cause of his friend as if he had been his brother. The English lawyer's reputation was known to every member of the Bar of New York, and there had been, and still was, a bitter opposition to his admission. But when it became known that their eloquent leader was his champion, many began to feel that after all, the poor fellow ought to be given another chance. And when at the next meeting of the Bar Association a Gorman in a set oration brought all his splendid eloquence into play, the cause was won. Great-hearted O'Gorman had helped this lame dog over the stile, but the dog's heart was not in the right place, and, as my reader will see in the sequel, he soon went lame again. In the rear room of a somewhat luxurious range of offices in a building on Broadway, facing the City Hall, 4 men were engaged in discussing what was evidently an exciting topic. The door of the main office bore the sign Edwin James, Counsellor at Law and Register in Bankruptcy. He was one of the 4. He had failed lamentably in his efforts to secure a practice. The effects of O'Gorman's eloquence had in the grey light of commonplace day faded away, the more so when the ideal his magic had created in the minds of men was in hourly contrast with the man himself and his history. His professional brethren looked upon him with suspicion, and there was a general impression abroad that his escapades were not over yet. He had launched out in his office and home somewhat extravagantly, and now, once again pressed by clamorous creditors, he had once more drifted upon the borderlands of crime, and was here with his companions planning a criminal transaction in order to pay his more pressing debts. One of these 4 was Bray, who, with a keen eye to business, had married the discarded daughter of a wealthy but not over-respectable New York family, and he had, unsuspected, pulled the wires so that James had been employed as the family lawyer, and in that capacity had drawn the will of the mother. She was an imperious, hot-tempered body, one who, when aroused, was accustomed to use language more vigorous than polite, and who not infrequently went to fisticuffs with her daughters. The husband and father, the creator of the fortune, was dead, and the vast family property, in securities, stocks, and lands, was vested absolutely in the mother. In the old lady's will, Brayer's wife, the second daughter of the house, there were no sons, was down in the very first paragraph for the magnificent sum of $1 lawful currency, and her name nowhere else appeared in the lengthy document. The old lady was such a termagant, and so implacable in her hatreds, that it was a moral certainty she would never relent and change her purpose toward her daughter. But James had also drawn up a second will of his own, and Breer's concoction, and a precious piece of villainy it was, in which the wife was down for legacies amounting to $750,000. The genuine will James kept in his own possession, ready to destroy the very moment word came that the old lady was an immortal, while the spurious will was kept in the vaults of the Safety Deposit Company, there to remain until the death of the testatrix, when of course it would in due time be produced. Brayer had been introduced to the other 3 men, and cultivated their acquaintance in the belief that they would some day be useful to him. He had a few days before introduced them to James. As a matter of precaution, he had concealed from them all knowledge of the will. At the same time, he gave them a hint that there was something in the wind, but that some way must be found to secure at once a few thousands, enough for a year or 2, until the good time came when fortune was to lavish her favours on them all with a liberal hand. But money must be had at once, for Brayer and James were in sore straits, particularly James, who had been threatened with arrest and was so far involved that he always entered and left his house at night in order to escape importunate creditors. This was James's second interview with the men, and the first time he had been alone with them. He saw at once that he had to do with able, clear-headed men, took them into his confidence, and, in order to excite their hopes and to bind them to him as well, he confided to them the plot of the forged will, producing the genuine for their inspection. He assured them that it was a sure and speedy fortune, as the lady was old and frail in health, and he also promised they should share between them 100,000, provided they would stand by to give a hand in the somewhat improbable event of the other heirs disputing the will, but above all, if they would devise some means to furnish him at once 10,000, or at least 5,000. Money he must have, and he could no longer do without it. The result of our conference in James's office was that the very next day an office downtown was engaged under a fictitious name, and a simple, unsuspicious fellow hired as porter and messenger. After some little negotiation, we obtained particulars of parties banking with the then great firm of J. Cook and Company, corner of Wall and Nassau Streets. Briefly told, The result was that 4 days later, a messenger walked into their banking house with a check for $20,000, purporting to be signed by another firm who banked with them. Along with the check went a letter bearing a signature well known to the cashier, asking him to pay the check to bearer. The result of all being that 5 minutes thereafter, we were walking unconcernedly up Broadway and sending a message to James to meet us at Delmonico's, corner of Broadway and Chambers Street. We sat down awaiting his arrival. He had anxiously been looking for news, and almost before we had seated ourselves he entered, eager and anxious, looking, but when he glanced at our faces, a happy expression came over his own, and without a word he put out his hand. After a warm greeting, I produced the roll, and, to his delight, I handed over to James 10 500s. On the morrow I went to the office, and, paying my messenger a week's wages, besides making a small gift, told him he need not come any more. With this 20,000 coup we fondly thought all our troubles and all our unlawful acts were ended. We now had a few thousands, sufficient to last until the 5,000 we had invested in the will case should bring in a dividend that would mean a fortune for us all. So we took things easy about town, and altogether thought ourselves pretty good fellows, and this world a very good sort of place to be in. Thus the winter passed by, and the summer was at hand. Our thousands of the year before had dwindled to hundreds, and the old lady whose heirs we had constituted ourselves seemed to have renewed her youth, and threatened to outlive us all. Besides this, there had grown up a repugnance in our minds to the business, and when one day my friend Mac remarked it was a scoundrelly business to rob the heirs of an estate, and they women, George and I, heartily acquiesced, and we vowed we would take no part in the matter, and then and there resolved we would throw both James and Breyer over, but first to use Breyer and James for our own purposes. Once more we found ourselves planning a coup in Wall Street. Talking the matter over, we three soon had a plan, and, being dowered with intense energy, it promised a successful termination. Audaciously enough, we determined the lightning should strike once more in the same place, that is, to make J. Cook and company again the victims. Irving and his honest fellows were to cooperate by watching everything, and, if any arrest threatened, to be on hand to make it themselves, and then let the prisoner escape. Most important of all, when the bankers drove up in hot haste to police headquarters to give information, James, honest James, would be on hand to receive them, would call in his 2 trustees to get with him full particulars of the robbery and a description of the men. Then the bankers would be sent away with assurances that we know the men and will have them, but at the same time warning them to keep the matter a secret in order better to enable them to catch the villains. If successful, the detectives were to receive 25% between them. Our plan required James to play an important part, and, although no confederacy could be fixed on him, yet he would hardly escape questioning and a very considerable degree of suspicion. So much so that it probably would put an end to any lingering remnants of character he had on hand or in stock. But he was tired of America and determined to go to Paris with his share of the plunder. Our visits to James had always been in his private office, and his clerks had never seen either of us or Breyer. Our plan was to make use of James' office in a way that will appear later. As related, he was suspected by his profession, but the general public thought him a very great man. He had appeared as volunteer counsel in 2 or 3 murder cases, and had delivered powerful addresses which had attracted considerable notice in the papers. One day, soon after our plan was matured, Breyer went to Philadelphia, and, by a mixture of audacity and finesse, procured from J. Cook himself, the parent house of the New York firm of J. Cook & Co. was in Philadelphia, a letter of introduction to the manager of the New York firm. He wanted the letter ostensibly in order to consult the manager about certain investments which he, as executor of an estate, desired to make for his wards. The transaction was made to appear as one of considerable magnitude, in which there would be large commissions paid. With the grand send-off of a letter from J. Cook to his subordinate in New York, the speculation opened well, so well that we at once decided what we would do with the money when we got it. A case in point for the old proverb. We had ascertained the name of a Newark manufacturer who had recently failed in business. I will call him Newman. On the morning after his return from Philadelphia, Breyer presented himself at James's office. It being arranged that James himself be out, so Breyer told the clerk that his name was Newman, that he had lately failed in business, and intended to employ Mr. James to put him through the bankruptcy court. The clerk told him to come again at 12, and he would find Mr. James in. At 12 he came. The clerk introduced him. James kept the clerk conveniently near, that he could hear the conversation. Breyer, as Newman, told James he had used in his business $240,000 belonging to his wife and her mother, and that in scheduling his assets he proposed to use enough to make those amounts good, intending to conceal the fact from his creditors. He determined to invest the amount in bonds, so ran his story, and was going to deposit the money in the bank that very afternoon, at the same time producing his letter of introduction from J. Cook. All of this, of course, being for the eye and ear of the clerk, who might be required as a witness of his employer's good faith. Bray Newman also paid James, in presence of the clerk, a retaining fee of $250, which was privately returned. James banked in Jersey City, and when Newman said, "Introduce me at your bank, as I want a small credit handy," James said, "My bank is in Jersey City." The clerk's brother was paying teller at the chemical bank, and, as was expected, he at once spoke up, saying, "Let me introduce Mr. Newman in the chemical bank." So down went Newman and the clerk. And in 10 minutes our man had the chemical bank checkbook in his pocket, and $5,000 to his credit in the bank. The same afternoon he presented his letter of introduction at J. Cook & Co.'s, and was cordially received. He, of course, told a totally different story there. In this case, a relative, lately deceased, had left him an estate of great value. He was, he said, realizing on his real estate and buying bonds as fast as his money came in, and he wanted to invest $1 million in various railway bonds. At present he had $240,000 on hand, which he wanted to invest in government bonds. He then left for the time being, leaving a good impression, which his refined manner and appearance confirmed. So far all was well, that is, all was well from our point of view. The next 2 or 3 days Breyer paid several visits to the chemical bank, getting small checks for $501,000 certified, and now had his account drawn down to $1,000. The day before he had called on J. Cook & Co., and told them he would take $240,000 in 7/30s, bearer bonds, and that he would call the next day and pay for them. At the same time, he got them to give him a pro forma bill for them. The eventful day had come, and James, to get his head clerk out of the way, sent him to the Admiralty Court to take notes of the evidence in a case going on there. At 10 o'clock Bray sent a messenger with a note to the bankers, requesting them to send the bonds to Edwin James' office, and he would pay for them on delivery. He could not come himself, as he was in consultation with the executors of the estate. In the meantime, a cheque for the full value of the bonds, $240,000, had been made out. It was drawn on the chemical bank, and was in fact similar to those always given between bankers on bond transactions. Breyer had drawn his own cheque for $240,000, and had it in his hatband with the $240,000 dummy cheque. The plan is palpable enough. When the messenger brought the bonds, Breyer, or Newman, was going to say, "All right, I have the cheque here, bring the bonds, and we will go to the chemical bank and get them to certify my cheque." Then, when at the bank he would take out both cheques, letting the messenger only get a glimpse of one, and that would be the small $241, which Breyer would pass in through the window with a request to have it certified. This would be done, and when handed out, of course, Breyer was to change it and hand the messenger the big one of home manufacture. It seemed impossible for the scheme to fail, and success in it meant on the surface comparative wealth for us all, with perhaps in the not distant future an entrance through the McAllister-guarded portals of the 400. But here we have a vivid instance of how easily an elaborate scheme can, by the merest accident, fall to pieces. The night before the expected coup we met James for a final full-dress rehearsal for the morrow, and after everything was settled adjourned to the uptown Delmonico's for supper. It so happened that Detective George Elder was there. This Elder was a bright fellow, was in a ring, but not in our ring, and, of course, had his bank account, diamond pin and turnout for the road. He had had some acquaintance with me, but the rest of the party was strangers. I did not see him at the time, but it would seem he was curious, even suspicious, from some scraps of conversation he overheard. However, neither his curiosity nor suspicion would have been of any consequence or concern to us, had it not been that, in going out, Breyer left on the table with some papers, the memorandum or pro forma bill of the bonds given him the day before by the bankers. Strangely enough, the body of the bill alone was intact. The heading bearing the name of the firm and purchaser had been torn off and destroyed. Elder picked it up, and, having some vague suspicions of a plot somewhere, he determined to go around among the 100 or more bankers and brokers in and around Wall Street and investigate quietly, without making any report to his superiors, his immediate superior being, of course, our honest friend, the worthy chief of the detective force, who was anxiously looking for his percentage of the deal. The whole force was split up into cliques, each intensely jealous of every other, each with its own stamping grounds, and each strictly protected his own preserves. At 9:30 the next morning, Elder started around carrying the fragment of the memorandum he had picked up from bank to bank and from one broker to the other. He had spent over an hour making inquiries and walked into J. Cook & Co.'s office just as the messenger was leaving with the bonds for James's office. 15 minutes more, and the game was ours. Elder produced the memorandum, and they at once recognized it as their own. Elder asked them if they knew their man and were sure it was all right. They said it was perfectly right, that Mr. Newman had been introduced by the head of the firm in Philadelphia, and was also a client of Edwin James, but then it was strange the bill should be mutilated. Elder averred his belief that a fraud was intended, and suggested that he and the manager should accompany the messenger with the bonds. This alarmed the manager, and he directed Elder and the messenger to await his return. Seizing his hat, he started for James's office to investigate. James was there, and Breer, the pseudo-Newman, was in the private office with the 2 checks ready, anxiously awaiting the arrival of the messenger with the bonds. Myself and all the other members of our party were nearby, watching and awaiting developments. The manager, considerably perturbed, entered the office, and James saw at once the business was a failure, for he knew, of course, that any suspicion as to good faith would be fatal to the success of the plot. Breer, hearing the voices and supposing it was the messenger with the bonds, opened the door of the private office and was vexed to see the manager, who, shaking him by the hand, told him the bonds would arrive soon, at the same time saying, "I suppose you will pay currency for the bonds?" To which Breer replied, "I will go to my bank with you now and get my check certified for the amount and give it to you, or leave it until the messenger comes with the bonds." This offer, along with Breer's coolness, apparently disarmed all suspicions, and he said, "Oh, all right, the messenger will go to the bank with you." He left the office, but stopped in the hall for a moment, then turned and hastily re-entering, said, "By the way, Mr. Newman, please draw the currency from the bank and pay the notes to the messenger upon delivery of the bonds." So the grand coup had failed, ignominiously failed, and through what appeared a trivial accident. More such accidents at critical periods will appear before this history is ended. The dummy check was still in our hands, and was at once destroyed, so, with nothing to fear, we coolly walked up Broadway to dinner, and talked of the future over a bottle of wine. At last we fixed upon a definite plan. Clinking our glasses, we drank to Eastward Ho! Chapter 11. Crack, THE lawyer's voice, THAMAY, never more false titles plead, NOR sound HIS quillets shrilly. The Eastward Ho! Was a hint of a project we had frequently talked over as a possible speculation. Here we see how men are led on step by step from bad to worse when once they set out on the primrose way. In returning from Europe with the 10,000 commission in my pocket, I vowed never again to engage in any unlawful speculation. I was through. No criminal life for me. Then came the day when we struck for the 20,000 and won, and we were all happy in the thought that our last unlawful deed was over. Then we took the 3rd step we had vowed never to take, and had discussed the 240,000 project. We had spent money on it, had laid our plans cunningly and deep, and were confident of success. We had even planned how to invest our thousands in an honest business, and so win the esteem of all good men, and of course, in some happy future would make restitution. But that is a future which never comes in the history of crime. These 3 wrong steps had been taken only after convincing ourselves that the circumstances justified each separate act. Such is the contradiction of human nature that even when planning crime we not only intended to make restitution, but despised all other wrongdoers and reprobated their crimes. Each wrongful act of ours was to be the last, and it was with something like despair that we began to realize that there was no stopping place on the dangerous road we were treading. My 13,000 commission from the European trip had melted away. Our share of the 20,000 got from J. Cook & Co. was fast going. Our deep-laid plot to win 240,000 had miscarried, and now the necessity was upon us of engaging in another illegitimate operation if we would continue in our life of ease and luxury. For the next few days we did little but dine and plan. Discussion followed discussion, and through them all we clung to the general proposition that we would not do any more in our particular line in America. At last we resolved to go to Europe and realize the fortune that seemed to elude our grasp at home. We resolved to tell Irving in a general way that we were going to Europe to make some money, and would pay him and his two fellows their percentage. Then we could, apparently, work with impunity, for, of course, if we committed a forgery in Europe and were recognized as Americans, as probably we would be, the foreign police would report the case to the New York police, that is, to Irving, and we should be safe in New York. Edwin James and Brea had dropped out of our lives for good, but as my readers will be curious to know of their fate in after times, I will relate it in this chapter. The morning our scheme on J. Cook & Co. fell to pieces as soon as the manager left the office, telling Brea he was to pay cash for the bonds in place of the cheque, it was recognized at once that the game was up, and the only thing remaining was to shield James as much as possible. So Brea left the office, but first instructed the clerk to tell the messenger when he came that he had gone for the money and would call for the bonds. This was done. The messenger arrived, being accompanied by Detective Elder all the time, and took the bonds back again. At 2 o'clock, James went down to the banker's, where he was well known, and inquired for Mr. Newman. Being told he was not in, he said he had made an appointment to meet him there. Invited into the inner office, the manager asked him if he had any personal knowledge of this Mr. Newman, and James said no further than that he had called, and given him a retaining fee of $250, and had engaged him as legal adviser, and so on then. The manager produced a telegram he had received in answer to one he had sent to the Philadelphia house, inquiring about Newman, and asking if his letter of introduction was genuine or not. James read the reply. It said the letter was genuine, but that they knew absolutely nothing about the man and warned him to be cautious. James pretended astonishment and feigned to be very indignant, declaring that if Mr. Newman did not put in an appearance within half an hour, he should begin to fear a fraud had been attempted. When the closing hour came at 3 o'clock, the manager announced to James that he should give the whole matter to the press, but would keep his name out of it. So they parted with warm congratulations over their escape, the manager pretending to believe James was an innocent tool, but no doubt with a shrewd suspicion that he intended to have a finger in this pie, had the pie ever been baked and divided. Had the bankers been victimized, they would have striven with all their power to keep the fact a secret and forbidden their employees to breathe a word about it to anyone. But now the case was different. All the morning papers had long accounts of the transaction. They were absurdly inaccurate, but all agreed as to the extreme cleverness of the manager, and noticed how he had suspected and so on, while poor Elder, who both expected and really deserved all the glory, was not even mentioned in the newspaper accounts. However, his feelings were soon after solaced, as Irving informed us that Elder had stood in on a deal that paid him well. The $5,000 we gave James eased up matters for a time. Practice he had none, but managed to hold on in the hope of realizing on the Brea will matter, but getting deeper and deeper in debt. One night, 4 years later, the old lady, Brea's mother-in-law, had a more than usually furious outbreak of temper and fell to beating the 3 daughters still living with her. Before it was over, she had attacked and seriously injured the eldest, and then flew to her room in a passion. Not appearing at breakfast the next morning, her daughter went to her room, but she was not there, and the bed was undisturbed. Going to the room that served for office and library, they found the door, as usual, locked. Bursting it open, the poor old maids found their mother huddled in a corner of the room dead. Truly a happy relief for the daughters. Poor girls, theirs had been a hard life. Every suitor who tried to cultivate their acquaintance had been driven from the door by the mother, who never spent $1 on their education, and her death found them all unused to the ways of the world. The result was that all became victims of fortune, hunters, and the unhappy ladies only changed the tyranny of an unnatural mother for the tyranny of a husband, who in each case wedded for wealth alone, and all 3 husbands were uncultured men. What an experience! 2 of the 3 still live. How sweet the rest of the grave will be to them. The genuine will was destroyed, and the family lawyer, James, immediately after the funeral, produced and read the last will and testament of the dead woman. The 4 sisters and a host of poor relations were present at the reading. When Sarah, Brea's wife, heard her name read as chief heir of the vast estate, she was stunned. But if she was stunned, the rest of the family were paralyzed. Legacies were left to many, small in amount, save in the case of the other 3 sisters, who were to have a certain tenement and land in Harlem and $3,000 a year for life out of the estate. None of those present thought for a moment of questioning either the genuineness of the will or the validity of the testaments, save only a poor relation, a nephew, whose name was down for $500. He was indignant with the old lady, and loudly declared that he would not put up with it. The next day he employed a briefless lawyer, one that had wit and brass enough and who had his way to make in the world and was determined to make it. Without waiting for the will to be probated or having legal authority to do so, Brea and his wife, the very day of the funeral, moved into the house and took possession. Before the week was out, he had persuaded the 3 old maids that they would be happier if away from the scene of their parents' death, so he had them installed in their own house at Haarlem, he remaining in undisturbed possession, waiting only for the will to be probated in order to take possession of upward of 200,000 in cash and bonds still in the custody of the old lady's bank. He had full possession of the house, and with entire confidence waited to be put in legal possession of all. But little did he dream that at that moment there was one poor torn sheet of foolscap in the library, casually thrust in a book, lying completely at his mercy to destroy, if he could only have known it, which was going to tear all his wealth from his grasp and drive him forth a foiled plotter, to become an adventurer and ultimately to perish a miserable outcast. The executors of the will, the same in the forged will as in the genuine, were 2 simple shopkeepers living near. Egan was the name of the nephew, and to the surprise of the executors his attorney notified them he should contest the will on behalf of his client, and warned them to dispossess Brea of the house until such time as the law decreed it to be his wife's property. The attorney knew the standing of James in his profession, and, being capable of pretty sharp practice himself, he, by some extraordinary intuition, boldly asserted his belief that the will was a forgery. The 3 sisters declared they would not contest the will, and had Brea acted wisely by fixing it up to give the attorney a liberal fee, and Egan a paltry $1,000, it would have ended there. But, feeling perfectly secure, no doubt he thought an appearance of firmness would strengthen his position still more, and he was so rash as to denounce the attorney as a shyster and blackmailer. The attorney's blood was up. He frightened the sisters into supporting him in disputing the will, and had Brea and his wife ousted from the house and the sisters reinstalled. Brea then attempted negotiations with the attorney. Cautious as he was, he said enough to convince the lawyer that for some reason he did not want the case to come before the courts. Still the attorney was half inclined to join hands with Brea. In the meantime, Ezra, this was the name of the man of law, had acquired great power over the sisters, and they all looked to him both as champion and protector. He resolved to be protector to one, at least, paying assiduous court to Jane, the youngest. Although past 30, and without education or accomplishments, she was warm-hearted and extremely sentimental, and a thrill went through her tender heart when it became evident that Ezra's attention pointed at her. She quickly made him a hero, and invested the thin-shanked, narrow-chested, waspish attorney with 1,000 tender attributes, and when, after 1 month's acquaintance, she found herself alone with him in the poky little parlour, and he asking her to be his wife, her woman's heart overflowed, and telling him she had loved him from the first hour they met, she threw herself into his arms, crying she was the happiest and most favoured woman in the world. In the midst of the happy lovers' talk, she ran to the shelf, took down a book, and, opening it, revealed a soiled sheet of paper and asked her lover what it was. His love had given him a gift indeed. His trained eye recognised it at once as a draft of a new will, in the handwriting of the deceased mother, and dated the very night of her death. It was a rough draft, but across the bottom was drawn the bold, masculine signature of the old lady. There were no signatures of witnesses, but Ezra was lawyer enough to know it would stand, and that it revoked all previous wills. Calling in the 2 elder sisters, he read the will to their amazed ears, and then and there wrote out a full statement as to the circumstance under which it was found. All 4 attached their signatures to the document, and when Ezra kissed his love a tender good night and went home, he hardly felt the paving stones under his feet, for he had carefully tucked away in the inside pocket of his vest, just over his heart, the little soiled piece of paper which told him in unmistakable terms that his fortune was made, and the wedding ceremony once over, that it was beyond all chance of change. It would seem that the old lady, after her quarrel with her daughters, went to the library in a rage and made the draft of a new will. The chief change in it, as compared with the old genuine will which the conspirators had destroyed, was that it was more favourable to Jane, Ezra's wife-to-be. But what gave Ezra the greatest satisfaction was the fact that Brea's wife was down by name in the new will for $1 lawful currency. The will was promptly filed and probated. Ezra gave bonds and was appointed one of the executors, and he had what to him was the immense satisfaction of denouncing Brea to his face as a forger and villain. Before the discovery of the new will, While it was believed that Mrs. Brea was an heiress and her credit good, she and her husband had made use of the fact and had incurred debts to a large amount. Brea got his wife to endorse his note for 10,000, and he borrowed that sum from the bankers. But as soon as the true state of the case was known, his creditors became clamorous and had him arrested on civil suits. Unable to give bonds, he was locked up in Ludlow Street Jail, and there he remained 6 months, until, acting upon Ezra's advice, the sisters agreed to pay all his debts and give him and his wife 1,000 each if they would live west of Chicago. This they were forced to accept and went to Montana. I opened a saloon at Butte City, but he never recovered his spirits again. He became his own best customer, and that, of course, meant ruin. But what, after all, killed him was the knowledge that he had been for more than a score of days in full possession of that old house and had spent scores of hours alone in the old library, and yet had not discovered and destroyed the new will lying there at his mercy. The sheriff soon sold out his saloon, while his wife eloped with his best friend. Ruined in pocket, health and character, poor old Brea was left bare to every storm that blew. One morning, as the sun was rising over the town, surprising half a dozen belated gamblers in Ned Wright's saloon as they were getting up to leave, they found lying across the threshold the body of a man, ragged, emaciated, forlorn. It was Brea. As soon as James had read the will, he insisted upon having 5,000 from Brea at once, and he got the money. But when that thunderbolt of the new will fell on the two men, James sadly recognized that fortune, and he would shake hands no more, so far as this world is concerned, and he resolved to chance returning to London before the whole of the 5,000 he had from Brea was gone. To London he went. He lived a few years in extreme poverty, driven to all manner of miserable shifts, and at last died. This man died who ought to have been buried in Westminster Abbey, so adding one more brilliant name to the long line of illustrious Lord Chancellors from Thomas, a Becket, and Cardinal Wolsey down. But he, hating his own soul, took the first step in wrongdoing, and, instead of resting in the mighty abbey and bequeathing his dust as a precious legacy to succeeding generations, perished forlorn and alone, and was buried in a pauper's grave. Chapter 12. Restes ICI, MES Enfants. We all landed in Liverpool in the highest spirits, and at once took the train for London, enjoying the novelty of everything. It was settled that George should pursue the venture alone in France, while I should go with Matt to Germany to act as his second there. To keep entirely clear myself, but at the same time to watch everything, to exchange the German notes he obtained, and to be ready to help if anyone should attempt to detain him. Therefore, after completing certain preparations which required skill and considerable business knowledge, we departed to execute this new, and of course, last shuffle for fortune. We had selected Berlin, Munich, Leipzig and Frankfort as the scenes of our operations in Germany. In France we sought to operate in Bordeaux, Marseille and Lyons. At 8 p.m. Saturday we all crossed to Calais together, where George said goodbye, and, leaving us to take the train eastward to Berlin, he started west to Bordeaux. We were not to meet again until after our hurried rush through the continent and our return to London with the proceeds. Before I give an account of Mac's adventure and my own for the next 3 days, I will here give George's narrative in his own language as related to us when we all met again in London. After saying goodbye to you, I arrived in Paris in due time and sauntered about for 2 hours until the train left for Bordeaux, where I arrived at 8 o'clock Monday morning and went at once to the Hotel d'Orient, and after a bath and breakfast repaired to the bankers. As soon as I presented my letters of introduction, they received me with the greatest consideration, lavishing every attention upon me, inviting me to dinner, and to a drive through the city afterward. I thanked them, and explained that I was obliged to decline, as my agent was waiting for me at Bayonne, where I had purchased some real estate, and, having been recommended to their firm, I should feel obliged if they would cash my draft for L2000 and endorse it on my letter of credit. The manager replied that it was the custom of the French bankers to require 24 hours' notice before drawing a cheque, and asked me if the next day would not answer. "We shall be happy to assist you," said he, "in passing the time pleasantly." This was a new custom to me, but I answered instantly, expressing regret that the nature of my business precluded delay, it being necessary that I should reach Bayonne that night. "I suppose," continued I, "that your bankers will not mind your checking out a small sum without the usual notice. However, if it occasions any embarrassment or inconvenience, I can easily procure the money elsewhere." One of the partners replied that their bank would without doubt honor their check, and the matter should be attended to at once. I sat down for a half-hour, conversing on a variety of topics. Of course, this was a most trying period to me. The least show of haste or anxiety might have betrayed me to those lynx-eyed, experienced men of business. In the midst of our conversation, an undercurrent of thought kept running through my mind thus: who knows? But they have sent a dispatch to the Union Bank of London, merely as a matter of business precaution, and that they are delaying me to get a reply. In that case, I shall have a good opportunity to learn the pure French accent while passing my days in the bagnio at Toulon. At last, however, the amount was paid over to me in French banknotes. I deliberately counted them and took leave, lighter in mind and heavier in purse by 50,000 francs. I had arranged that I would send all the money I obtained to the Queen's Hotel, London, by post at the earliest possible moment after receiving it, that in the event of any accident to myself the money should be safe. After receiving the money, I enclosed it in a large envelope, addressing it to the hotel in London. I also wrote on the envelope, "Échantillons de papier," i.e., samples of paper, after which I threw it into the post office. As I wished to reduce the risk as much as possible, the train for Marseille not leaving for 3 hours, I took a carriage and told the driver to take me toward the next station on the way to that city. After we were fairly out in the country, I got outside and sat with the driver, chatting with him about the country we were driving through, arriving in the village about half an hour before the train from Bordeaux was due. I dismissed my driver at a small village cabaret, tavern, walked to the station, got aboard the train, and early the next morning was in Marseille. I breakfasted at the Hotel d'Europe, and looked over the papers to see if the Bordeaux fraud had been discovered. As I could see no indication of it, about 10 a.m. I took a carriage and went to call on Messrs. Eze, Brune and Co. On making myself known, I was, as usual, received with the utmost courtesy, began to talk business, and one of the firm got into my carriage and rode with me to his bank to effect the sale of my draft on London for the sum of L2 per 500 tes. Arriving at the bank, I took a seat in the front office, while Mr. Brune went into the manager's room to introduce the transaction. The clerks eyed me, as I thought, suspiciously, but doubtless only curiously, because they perceived I was a foreigner. Another thing which I noticed sent a shiver through me. After Mr. Brune had been a few minutes in the manager's room, the bank porter stepped to the outer door, closed and locked it. It being but 12 o'clock, I imagined the precautionary measure must be due to my presence. "The Bordeaux affair is discovered and has been telegraphed all over France," was my first thought. "All is over with me. I am a candidate for a French prison, sure." These and 1,000 other thoughts flashed through my mind during the quarter of an hour preceding Mr. Brune's reappearance with his hands full of banknotes. I could hardly believe my eyes. I had suppressed all signs of the internal hurricane which raged during those prolonged moments of suspense. Now the revulsion of feeling was so great that I nearly fainted. However, by a mental effort, I recovered my self-possession and effectually masked all inward convulsions. Mr. Brune placed in my hands 62,000 francs in notes of the Bank of France, and we then descended to the carriage and drove to my hotel, where we parted. I paid my bill, and at once made preparations to start for Lyons, which was to be the next and last scene of my operations in France. As my train did not leave for 3 hours, I got into a carriage at some distance from the hotel and was driven toward the next station, located on the beautiful bay a few miles from Marseille. After driving along the shore of the bay for some miles, I remember we met 2 women, dressed in the quaint costume common to that part of the country, each carrying a basket of eggs. I stopped the carriage and endeavoured to enter into conversation with the pair, but could not understand a word of their patois. I then took a couple of eggs, handed out a silver franc piece, and drove on, leaving 2 astonished women standing in the road, gazing alternately at the piece of money and at the back of my carriage. Arriving at the station, I found it would be an hour and a half to train time, and driving to a hotel on the shore, I ordered dinner to be served in the upper room of a 2-story tower overlooking the bay, with Marseille in the distance. After dining, I strolled along the beach, looking at some queer fish not found north of the Mediterranean, their colours vying in brilliancy with the plumage of tropical birds. Returning to the station, I took a ticket for Lyons, stopping off at Arles about sunset, as I wished to see the amphitheatre and other relics of the Roman occupation. I remained in Arles till midnight, then took the train, arriving in Lyons at 9 the next morning. Repairing to the Hotel de Lyons, I had breakfast, and on looking over the papers became satisfied that as yet no discovery had been made. Therefore, I resolved to carry out my third and last financial enterprise and then return to London with all speed. I called a carriage and drove at once to the establishment of Messrs. Cadert & Co. I sat near the desk, conversing with the head of the firm, and opened a dispatch I sent from Arles, and, after reading, handed it to him, saying, "I see that I shall have use for 60,000 francs, and must ask you to cash a draft on my letter of credit for that amount." He immediately stepped to the safe, took out a bundle of 1,000-franc notes, and counting out 60, gave them to me. As it was almost certain that the Bordeaux fraud would soon be discovered, I determined, now that my risky work was completed, to attempt an immediate escape from France by way of Paris and Calais. I did not, therefore, take the train direct from Lyons to Paris, but engaged a carriage and drove back to a junction toward Marseilles. Here I took a train which intersects further to the northward with another road leading through Lyons to Paris. After going the roundabout route above described, I was back at the Lyons station at 9 p.m. in a train bound for Paris, where I arrived without further incident. The next morning, Sunday, as I left the railway station, I thought detectives were watching me. But, in all probability, it was only the imagination of a guilty conscience. I was then wearing a full beard, and as a precautionary measure, I, that morning, had all shaved off save the moustache. Not daring to leave Paris on the through express, which started at 3 o'clock p.m., nor to purchase a ticket to either Calais or London direct, I went to the station and took the noon accommodation train, which went no further toward Calais than Arras, a town some 30 miles from Paris. I arrived there about 1 p.m. As it would be a couple of hours before the express train was due, I went to a small hotel and ordered dinner. To while away the time, I took a stroll through the main street, where were many mothers and nurses with children, nice black-eyed French babies. As I was always a devoted lover of children and other small creatures, I stepped into a shop and bought a package of confectionery, which I distributed among the little ones and their smiling nurses, receiving therefore almost invariably the grateful exclamation, "Merci, monsieur." I gave some to children, 8 and 10 years old, a crowd of whom soon gathered about me. Perceiving that I was attracting too much attention, it was clear that I must get rid of my young friends as soon as possible, or the police might also be attracted, and their presence would lead to unpleasant results in case the frauds had been discovered and inquiry was being made for an Englishman. Purchasing a second supply of candies, I hastily gave them out, and with a restez ici mes enfants, I passed through them and continued my walk up the street. Quite a number followed at a respectable distance, and I was cogitating how to double on them when I came to the gateway of the town cemetery, through which I hastily entered. The children remained outside and watched me as I walked up the slope and disappeared. At the rear of the cemetery, I observed an old man at work in the adjoining field. I climbed upon the stone wall, which instantly crumbled away, and I was landed on the old Frenchman's domain without leave, amidst a pile of stones. Startled by the racket, he looked up from his digging, and, seeing a stranger uprising from the ruins of the fence, began consigning him to Le Diable, with a volley of vigorous French expletives delivered in peasant patois. I listened to him, much amused for a moment, and then held up a 5-franc piece. As soon as he beheld it, a wondrous change came over him. He eagerly seized the silver, and straightway showed me to a lane which led almost directly to the railway station. I purchased a ticket for Calais, and took the Sunday afternoon express, and here I am. Chapter 13. WETALKOFTHE stars ANDDOTHHE other thing. After we saw George off to Paris on the train, Mac and I walked up and down the platform outside of the station, stargazing. Mac, with his brilliant scholarship, elegant speech, logical force and fiery enthusiasm, made a most fascinating companion. The study of mankind is man, the old proverb says, but like many other proverbs there is a full measure of unreality in it. It takes a good amount of arrogance and conceit for one to fancy he is going to study and understand men. No man can understand himself, and by no amount of experience or study will he ever come to understand that subtle thing he calls his mind, or understand the motives that sway him. I only wish one of those scientists who amuse themselves by pretending to study and understand human minds and motives could have sat in Mac's brain that night, have thought his thoughts and heard his speech, while remaining ignorant of our history and mission. Mac's mind was a storehouse of erudition, his memory a picture gallery, whose chambers were gilded and decorated with many a glowing canvas. As a child he was familiar with the Bible, the Old Testament particularly, and, improbable as it seems, was still a diligent student of Holy Writ. His mind was completely saturated with Bible imagery, yet there we were with our pockets full of forged documents walking up and down that platform stargazing, while he talked with intelligent enthusiasm of those silver flowers in the darkened sky, of stellar space, how in its infinity it proved the presence of deity. That with him there was no great and no little. That a thought sweeping across the God-given mind of an infant was as wonderful and as much an evidence of power as the millioned arch of radiant suns in the Milky Way. While speeding through Belgium on our way to the Rhine, he continued until the sun shone upon the horizon. It was something to stir one's enthusiasm to see his sublime faith in the mighty destiny of man, and to listen to him tell of the dignity and grace of every human soul and his sure faith that all would be garnered in the mighty plains of heaven. And he meant and felt it all, yes, meant all he said, believed all he said, believed that he himself was a potent factor in the divine economy, and, furthermore, believed it behooved every man to do all things, to be all things good and true. Yet on this Sunday morning we were fast speeding to the scene of our contemplated schemes, and with light hearts looked forward to a speedy return to London, fairly well laden with plunder. We talked the whole night through, or rather Mac talked, and I listened, and it was a treat to be a listener, he being the speaker. A period was put to his oration by the train stopping at Luxembourg, we being summoned to breakfast. On resuming our journey, we took a nap, and when we awoke, we found ourselves nearing the Rhine. About noon we arrived at Cologne, and going to Ulrichplatz, drank a bottle of Tokay in a famous wine cellar there. Then hurrying back to the station, we travelled across the sandy plain that stretches from near the Prussian border to the capital. We arrived soon after dark, and Mac went at once to the Hotel Lion de Paris and registered. I waited across the street in the shadow of the Emperor's palace. Mac soon came out, and we went to dine in a large café. We enjoyed the novelty of the scene, and were never tired of marvelling over the all-predominant militarism. Soldiers everywhere, all with good lungs and loud voices. We spent the evening seeing the town. At midnight, we parted to meet and breakfast together at the café at 8. I then went to an obscure hotel, and soon was in the land of dreams. In the morning I awoke with an anxious feeling, and found myself wishing it were night. At 8, the appointed time, I met Mac. He may possibly have felt some anxiety. If so, it was invisible. When an honest man makes a mistake, he has not only sympathy, but can always pick himself up again. With a rogue a mistake may easily be, and almost always is fatal. We feared the unseen and the unexpected. Above all, our imagination magnified the danger, while tormenting us with needless fears. In Germany the banks open at 9 o'clock, and we knew they would receive soon after 8 the letter we had deposited in the mail in London. We decided that it would be best for Mac to enter the bankers at 5 minutes after 9. We had discovered the night before the location of the firm. During breakfast, Mac went carefully through his pockets, taking out every scrap of paper and turning everything over to me. Then taking out from among the others in our bag the letters of credit and introduction, we made our last scrutiny of them. We had not settled upon the amount he should ask for, but agreed that it should not in any case be less than 25,000 gulden, 10,000. If everything seemed favourable, then Mac was to use his own judgment and demand any sum under 100,000 gulden, 40,000. His letter of credit was for L,000 and we did not want to leave it behind. Of course, if we drew any less sum than the amount the credit called for, the sum we drew would be endorsed on the letter, and it would be returned to Mac and be instantly destroyed. So with the documents in his pockets and giving me a smile, out he went, and I followed after, keeping him in sight, and very anxious I was. We were on unto Den Linden, walking one square and turning to the left half a block away were the bankers. Hebrew, by the way. I saw Max saunter up the steps and disappear from view. Outside of America, money transactions are carried on with the utmost deliberation, to an American with exasperating slowness, so I thought it possible he might remain invisible for a whole half-hour, and a long half-hour it would be to me. In order to have my anxiety shortened by even a half-minute, we had arranged that when he came out, if he had the money, he was to stroke his beard as a signal. If it was all right, but delayed, he was to put his handkerchief to his face, but if everything was wrong, he was to clasp his hands across his breast for a moment. In that event I was to keep a lookout to see if he was followed. If so, I was to give him a signal, when he would go straight to his hotel. In passing through would dispose of his tall hat, and put on the soft hat he had in his pocket. then pass out the back entrance and hasten to a certain hat shop where I would meet him, and take a cab to a little town 6 miles away called Audiobook, where all trains going south, west and east stopped. While driving out, we would settle on some plan. But this emergency did not arise. I had stationed myself in a little shop across the street, and from that vantage ground was watching for Mac's reappearance, and just as I had settled myself for a weary watch-out, he came, smiling and stroking his beard. A moment's glance satisfied me he was not followed. I hastened after, and, coming up with him as he turned the corner, he merely said £2,600, 13,000. It seemed too good to be true, and I said, "I don't believe you." He replied, "It is all right, my boy, here it is," at the same time thrusting a big package containing golden notes into my hand. We instantly separated, I hastening to different but nearby brokers' offices, buying for nearly the full amount French banknotes and gold. We went straight to the hatter's and bought one of those broad-brimmed German student hats, which, when he had placed it on his head, put on a pair of spectacles and parted his flowing beard in the middle, made such a transformation in his appearance that I myself would have passed him unrecognized. In the meantime I had picked out a cab driver, a stupid-looking, conservative-appearing old fellow, and engaged him to drive Mike und meinen Freund nach Jüterbock. So we entered the cab, an open one, horse affair, and started for that town. Our next objective point was Munich, but as the train did not leave until noon, we preferred to spend the time in a pleasant drive, and at the same time make assurance of our escape doubly sure. Around Berlin, the country is flat and uninteresting. Our driver was a crabbed old fellow, but we managed to extract some amusement out of him. What pleased us greatly was to see him from time to time take out from under his seat a loaf of black bread and cut off a slice for himself and one for his horse, and then, seeing we were in no hurry, he would get down, and walking beside the horse, would feed him and himself at the same time. When we arrived at Jüterbock we had an hour to spare, so we drove to an inn, and ordering a bottle of Hochheimer for ourselves and beer and pretzels for our driver, we passed the time pleasantly. In the meantime we had touched a match to the letter of credit, and at train time we went by separate routes to the depot. Each purchased his own ticket, to Nuremberg mine was, his to some nearby city, and at 12:30 we boarded the train and were off for Munich, and more profit there on the morrow. Late at night we arrived, and after locating the bank we went to a theatre, where a variety show was going on, and found the performances good, quite up, in fact, to similar exhibitions here. When the house closed we separated for the night, each going to a different hotel. Our plan was to secure all the cash we could in Munich, in time to take a train that left for Leipzig a little before 10 o'clock, arriving there soon after 1, in time to visit the Leipzig bank the same day. Then leaving the city that night, we would be in Frankfort early on Wednesday. We would then make all haste to escape from Germany to the shelter of mighty London. Tuesday morning at 7 we met at a restaurant, as agreed, and soon had over again our Berlin experience. But the amount we obtained here was only 12,000 gulden. L1,000, Mac thinking it best to ask for a small sum, Munich not being much of a commercial city. In cashing his credit, although the amount was in gulden, the bank paid him in New Saxon thalers, the thaler being 70 cents. We did not like the new thaler notes, and wanted to change them there, but there was no time if we were to catch the 10 o'clock train. I had Mac's derby hat in a box, and in 3 minutes he had the hat and spectacles on, and, with his beard again parted, the transformation was complete, and he, a perfect picture of the dreamy German student, sauntered down to the depot and bought his ticket for Leipzig. I followed him, carrying all the cash and documents in my bag. We arrived at Leipzig soon after dinner. Times were brisk, with plenty of bustle there, for the great Leipzig fair was in full blast. Here was an opportunity missed. We ought to have had 3 or 4 letters to as many banks. The place was thronged, and the banks were paying out and receiving money in thousands. On the train I had sat apart from Mac, but in the same compartment, which was filled. Arriving at Leipzig, he left the train and, walking up the street, entered a wine-room, where I joined him. He scrutinized his letters carefully, and, placing them in his pocket, in 5 minutes was in the bank. Seeing the bank was full of customers, instead of remaining outside to watch, I entered and stood among the crowd, anxious, of course, but letting nothing escape. Instead of waiting or trying to transact his business with a subordinate, Mac demanded to see the head of the firm. He was received at once, and upon the production of his letters was treated with the utmost consideration. He asked for 50,000 gulden, 20,000, which was given him at once. The amount for fair time at Leipzig was not large. In a very short time the business was done. The money being paid in golden notes, it made a pretty big bundle. As agreed upon, he went direct to the cafe, carrying the money, while I stopped at a broker's office and bought French money, notes and gold, for my new Saxon thalers. There the transformation scene was reenacted, but we could not leave town until 5 o'clock. We spent the time visiting the famous fair. Leipzig overflowed with the fair. It was fair on the brain with everyone. This annual fair has been a yearly feature of the old city for 4 centuries and draws to it people from all over the European world, even from furthest Russia. Soon after 5 o'clock we were on the train, but, for some reason which I now forget, we did not arrive until 10 o'clock the next day at Frankfort. Frankfort, the home and still the fortress of the Rothschilds. In Frankfort, the bourse opens at 10 a.m. and closes at 2. During those hours the bankers are to be found on the exchange only, and not at their offices. Many of the offices are then deserted and fast locked. It proved to be the case with the firm to which our letters were addressed, and if we were to do any business in Frankfort we had of necessity to wait until 2 p.m. But as it was now Wednesday, and the 3rd day since our affair in Berlin, the first draft drawn on London, if promptly mailed, would probably have been delivered at the Union Bank this morning. Of course, as soon as the manager of the foreign department found a draft for a large sum drawn by a stranger and made payable to their correspondent in Berlin, he would at once surmise that a fraud had been committed and undoubtedly would send a telegram to Germany to that effect. The forgery once known in Berlin, the rumour of it, with 1,000 exaggerations, might easily fly to every bourse in Europe, and I feared that by 2 o'clock the story might possibly become known on the Frankfort exchange. So far we had 43,000, the result of our 2 days' operations. But we had from the first great hopes of Frankfurt, chiefly because it was the money centre of the continent. Therefore the bankers were used to handling large sums of money, and so long as everything was all right, they would hand out any sum, however large. We really ought to have taken in Frankfort first. Had we done so, we probably would have left the town with 50,000. As soon as we arrived, we went to a cafe, and, leaving Mac there and all the money and papers in the bag, I hastened to the bankers, hoping to find them open and ready for business. In that case, I should have talked business, that is, about having letters of credit and so on, and I could probably have told by their actions if any rumours of our transaction of the 2 preceding days had reached the city. Had this been so, the bankers would have betrayed it by their looks and questions, and would have been anxious to see my credits. Had such questions been asked, I would have simply said that my letters of credit had not yet arrived from Paris. This would have, of course, thrown them off the track, and given us time to move off. But when I arrived, I found the doors locked. I at once returned to Mac and said, "We are through, let us catch the train for Cologne at once." He was anxious to wait until 4 o'clock and make a dash. We both knew the Germans were slow, and might not think of using the telegraph, and we agreed that we had more than an even chance of success, but Mac said, "My boy, you are my manager, and I leave it for you to decide." Then I said we were through, and that he should take no more chances, so we settled it right there, in the little French-German cafe. And taking out all the letters, and every scrap of paper, we destroyed them. This decision, of course, brought a great relief, for the strain had been greater than either of us had been willing to confess to the other. So, easy in mind, we ordered lunch. Of course, we would have no news of George until we met in London. We had no anxiety about him, we felt certain he would come out all right. While waiting for the train, we discussed the future, and took it for granted that he would secure as much as we had done. We counted ourselves possessors of 90,000. Of this, fully 10,000 would go to our 3 honest detectives in New York. We would spend about another 10,000, leaving us about 23,000 each. Making this calculation, we sat down, and with the cash safe in our hands we began planning for the future. Did we say, "Now we have a sum of money ample to start us in an honest business, and, as we have promised, we will quit"? Nothing of the kind, we simply ignored our many promises and resolutions. Our ideas had grown with our success, and we felt poor. So we quickly came to the conclusion that it was the part of wisdom, since we were already so far in, to secure 100,000 each, and then to call a halt. So there in Frankfort, in the very hour of our success, we found ourselves planning new schemes, and further down the Primrose Way. Soon after the noon hour the train started, but first I took Mac's tall hat to the hatter's and left it to be ironed. This, of course, to get rid of it, and leave no trace behind. Then, returning to the cafe, we started. I fell behind and we made our way separately to the depot. Mac had absolutely nothing about him save 2,000 in French paper and gold. I had over 40,000 in notes and some gold in my bag. He bought a ticket for Amsterdam, and I one for Belgium, both taking us through Cologne. I saw him safe into a car, while I sauntered carelessly up and down the station, swinging my bag and staring at everything, as the train was about to start. I entered another carriage. The railway from Frankfort to Cologne follows the riverbank for the entire distance. We quickly passed Bingen, Mayence, Koblenz, and about dusk reached Cologne. This is an important junction, and here we had to change cars, having 20 minutes to wait. Both of us went direct to the cathedral. It is close to the station, and there we had a few minutes' talk. Here Mac threw away his ticket to Amsterdam, and I gave him mine to Brussels. We agreed to take separate cars at the station, but at the first stopping place I was to join him in his compartment, for we had before us an all-night ride to Ostend, the rival port to Calais, where we would embark for Dover. At the depot I purchased a ticket to London via Ostend. We left Cologne all right, and at the first station out I alighted and joined him. We had a pleasant all-night journey, arriving very early the next morning at Ostend. How lovely the sea looked, with the morning sun shining on its restless waves. We got to Dover without accident, and 2 hours after the express landed us in London, and we drove at once to our appointed rendezvous, the Terminus Hotel, London Bridge. We had no news of George, but that evening, opening the door in response to a loud knock, he walked in, receiving a boisterous welcome.